A pristine living room with vacuum lines still fresh on the carpet stands in sharp contrast to the concrete front porch just a few feet away. A neighbor witnessed a stranger actively stalking the street. They reported the deeply suspicious behavior, but the horror of the abduction was about to be compounded by the sheer incompetence of the people arriving to investigate it. The officers standing on the porch looking at the blood were supposed to be the first line of defense. They were supposed to secure the perimeter and preserve the fragile forensic evidence left behind by the intruder. Instead, their arrival marked the beginning of a completely different kind of nightmare for the Guthrie family. The initial response to a violent crime scene is often referred to as the golden hour. It is the most critical window of time for law enforcement to secure physical evidence and establish a perimeter before contamination occurs. The actions taken during these first few hours can easily determine whether a case is solved or goes permanently cold. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, the golden hour was completely squandered by the Pima County Sheriff Department led by Sheriff Chris Nanos. The handling of the crime scene was not just flawed, it was reportedly a masterclass in catastrophic incompetence. According to investigative deep dives by True Crime Podcasts, the first responding officer assigned to the response from the authorities was a dismissive brush-off, claiming they had already handled the situation. They had not handled anything. Secure this massive kidnapping and suspected homicide scene had zero experience handling major crimes. They had never worked a homicide case. The results of this inexperience were immediately disastrous. The area surrounding the house was not properly cordoned off with crime scene tape in those crucial early hours. First responders and various personnel were allowed to trample all over the immediate vicinity, potentially destroying microscopic evidence and footprint impressions left by the attacker. The chaotic environment severely compromised the integrity of the scene. But the physical mishandling of the property was only the beginning of the frustration. When neighbor Aldine Meister saw the massive police presence, they immediately approached the detectives. Meister frantically reminded them about the suspicious man casing the neighborhood 3 weeks prior and the detailed report that had been filed. The response from the investigating officers was absolutely staggering. A detective allegedly looked at Meister and offered a cold and dismissive reply claiming they already did that. Who takes the time to manually disable the life-saving electronic monitoring systems of an elderly woman before they brushed off the most critical eyewitness statement in the entire investigation as if it were an annoying distraction? They had a prime suspect profile handed to them on a silver platter and they threw it in the trash. The arrogance on display was infuriating. The department was actively bleeding crucial time while trying to manage a scene they were clearly not equipped to handle. If you find yourself screaming at your screen over this level of amateur police work, take a second to hit the like button, because the negligence only gets worse from here. While the local deputies were busy contaminating the porch and ignoring witnesses, the attacker was already miles away. The failure to immediately lock down the surrounding grid allowed the suspect to slip right through their fingers. The incompetence of the Pima County Sheriff Department created a massive blind spot, but even the most prepared criminals make mistakes. Despite the botched crime scene at the house, a massive piece of physical evidence was discovered entirely by accident: abducting her. And why did the local police ignore the most critical witness statement ever recorded in this case? 2 miles away from the Guthrie residence, investigators found a discarded glove. This was not just a random piece of winter clothing. The glove was heavily contaminated with biological material. It contained DNA that did not belong to the victim. It was a direct physical link to the person who stood on that porch and disabled that camera. The attacker had made a fatal error in their escape route. The discovery of the glove offered a massive ray of hope in an otherwise disastrous morning. The biological evidence was safely collected and secured. It seemed like the case was finally about to break wide open. All the police had to do was hand the glove over to the experts and let the science do the talking. If you believe accountability is just as important as the evidence itself, hit that subscribe button and join us here in the Ellis Evidence Room. But the Pima County Sheriff Department was about to make another deeply controversial decision that would bring the entire investigation to a grinding halt. Who actually owned that glove? And why was the biological evidence suddenly trapped in an administrative nightmare? The answers reveal a turf war that prioritized local egos over a rapid federal resolution. The glove was the key to unlocking the identity of the masked intruder. But a key is utterly useless if the people holding it refuse to put it in the right lock. The biological profile hidden inside the fabric of that glove was waiting to be decoded. The discovery of the glove 2 miles from the crime scene completely shifted the trajectory of the investigation. The focus moved from the contaminated porch to the microscopic biological material left behind by the attacker. Forensic technicians were able to successfully extract a clear DNA profile from the fabric. This was the exact breakthrough the Guthrie family desperately needed. We do not just read the reports, we cross-examine them to find the truth hidden beneath police negligence. At the same time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved and compiled a detailed behavioral and physical profile of the primary suspect. According to the federal press releases, the authorities were hunting an alleged male offender standing approximately 5'9" to 5'10" tall. The suspect was described as wearing a mask and carrying a weapon. He was also reportedly carrying a black Ozark Trail backpack during the commission of the crime. Furthermore, multiple neighbors reported seeing a suspicious gray truck lingering around the neighborhood during the time frame of the abduction. These reports of the gray truck perfectly aligned with the earlier warnings about someone casing the area. The puzzle pieces were finally starting to form a terrifying picture. The alleged suspect was methodical, equipped with tools, and possessed a vehicle to quickly transport the victim away from the scene. The extracted DNA from the glove was the final nail in the coffin. Investigators confidently submitted the genetic profile into the combined DNA index system known as CODIS. We have to look closely at the chain of events, because a crime of this magnitude does not just happen without warning signs. This national database contains the genetic markers of millions of convicted offenders and arrestees across the country. A positive match would instantly provide a name, a photograph, and a known address for the kidnapper. The investigators waited for the system to process the data. The result came back completely negative. The suspect was not in the national system. The trail of the masked man with the black Ozark Trail backpack had suddenly hit a massive concrete wall. A negative CODIS result is extremely discouraging, but it is no longer the end of the line in modern forensic science. The immediate and standard next step for a high-profile federal kidnapping case is to utilize genetic genealogy. This involves sending the DNA sample to a highly specialized federal laboratory to build out a family tree and track down the suspect through their distant relatives. The FBI has access to the most advanced and rapid genetic genealogy resources on the planet. They have teams dedicated exclusively to tracing phantom DNA profiles. The signs were blaring like sirens for almost a month. The logical move was to immediately transfer the extracted DNA to the federal experts and let them hunt down the lineage of the attacker. But that did not happen. In a move that shocked legal experts and outraged the community, Sheriff Chris Nanos and the Pima County authorities reportedly blocked the FBI from taking immediate control of the genetic evidence. Instead of utilizing the massive power of the federal government, the local department chose to retain control of the evidence. They decided to send the crucial DNA sample to a private independent laboratory for analysis. This decision effectively bypassed the immediate federal resources and placed the most critical piece of evidence in a slow-moving private queue. The justification for this decision remains highly contested. The process of private genetic genealogy can take weeks or even months to yield actionable results. In a kidnapping case where an 84-year-old woman with a severe medical condition is missing, every single second matters. Time is the enemy of survival. The failure to act on those signs transformed a quiet residential street into an active crime scene. The choice to utilize a private lab instead of the FBI resources created an artificial and deeply dangerous bottleneck in the investigation. The federal profile of the armed man in the mask was practically useless without a name to attach to it. The gray truck remained unidentified. The DNA sat in a laboratory waiting for processing while the trail grew colder by the minute. The local department had essentially handcuffed the federal investigators. They had the physical evidence, and the federal agents had the immediate capability to analyze it on a massive scale. But the two sides were completely disconnected. The biological signature of the man who abducted Nancy Guthrie was locked away in a private facility. The family was forced to sit and wait in agonizing silence while administrative decisions dictated the pace of the hunt. The glove was supposed to be the ultimate solution, but it quickly transformed into a symbol of bureaucratic friction. The science was ready to speak, but the system forced it to remain silent. The true tragedy was that the identity of the attacker was resting right there in the genetic code, completely out of reach. The blood on the concrete could have been prevented if someone wearing a badge had simply chosen to listen, but they chose arrogance over vigilance. The local authorities had maintained their jurisdiction, but they had potentially sacrificed the speed required to bring an elderly woman back home alive. The standoff over the DNA was bad enough, but the internal chaos within the Pima County Sheriff Department was about to explode into public view. The conflict over the biological evidence was merely a symptom of a much deeper institutional rot. While the national media focused on the missing woman, a silent war was tearing the local law enforcement agency apart from the inside. The decision to sideline federal resources was not just criticized by outside observers. It ignited a massive internal rebellion. According to local reporting, the rank and file deputies within the department were utterly, completely exhausted by the ongoing leadership failures. The situation escalated to an unprecedented level of internal mutiny. The deputies' union initiated a formal vote of no confidence against the head of the department. This was a catastrophic public display of distrust right in the middle of a high-profile active missing persons investigation. Out there in the cold Arizona morning air rests a smeared trail of fresh human blood. Now, an elderly woman is missing, and the people sworn to protect her are desperately scrambling to cover their tracks. The men and women wearing the uniform were officially declaring that their own commander was unfit to lead. The implications of this internal uprising were staggering. The very agency tasked with coordinating a massive manhunt for a dangerous kidnapper was entirely fractured. Detectives were forced to navigate a toxic political minefield while trying to secure search warrants and conduct interviews. The focus shifted from finding a vulnerable citizen to managing a brutal public relations crisis. The federal authorities, who possessed the most sophisticated tracking capabilities on the planet, were essentially relegated to the bleachers. They were forced to watch local officials fumble basic investigative procedures. The friction between the federal agents wanting to push forward and the local command staff clinging to their jurisdiction created a lethal delay. When a high-risk incident occurs, the speed of information sharing is the only advantage law enforcement has against a prepared offender. Every single hour spent arguing over laboratory assignments or battling internal union disputes allowed the perpetrator to increase his distance from the initial incident location. 3 weeks before the violent abduction, the rhythm of the Catalina Foothills neighborhood was quietly broken. The suspect was already operating with a significant time advantage because of the delayed response on Sunday morning. Now, the systemic dysfunction was gifting him even more time to hide his tracks and conceal his captive. The community watched in absolute horror as the dysfunction played out on local news broadcasts. They expected a unified wall of blue closing in on a dangerous predator. Instead, they saw an agency unraveling at the seams. The lack of cohesive leadership meant that critical intelligence was likely falling through the cracks. It meant that leads were not being aggressively pursued. It meant that the person who orchestrated a flawless extraction of a targeted individual was slipping further away into the shadows. The sheer arrogance required to refuse the most advanced investigative resources in the world, while your own deputies are voting to remove you from power, is difficult to comprehend. According to reports from a local neighbor named Aldine Meister, a strange man appeared on the street. The local command staff was actively choosing to protect their own territorial pride over the immediate safety of an endangered resident. This was no longer just a story about a violent offender. It was a glaring expose of a broken system prioritizing ego over execution. It forces us to ask a difficult question down in the comments section. Where exactly is the line between protecting local jurisdiction and actively obstructing a federal manhunt? The answer to that question might be the key to understanding why this investigation stalled so spectacularly. The dysfunction within the department was not a sudden development. It was a pre-existing condition that had been festering for years. But it took a high-stakes crisis to expose the fatal flaws in the command structure. The consequences of this internal war were not theoretical. They were measured in the agonizing hours passing without a single trace of the abducted woman. The entire apparatus designed to serve and protect had effectively paralyzed itself. He was not a delivery driver or a lost tourist. The federal agents had the tools to break the case wide open, but their hands were tied by administrative red tape. The local detectives on the ground were demoralized and distracted by the chaos surrounding their leadership. The synergy required to solve a complex puzzle was completely absent. The perpetrator had banked on exploiting the blind spots of the neighborhood security grid. He probably never imagined he would benefit from the massive operational blind spots of the police department itself. The failure to launch a coordinated joint task force from minute one was a fatal error that cannot be undone. The golden window for a rapid recovery had permanently slammed shut. The focus now shifted entirely to the slow and tedious process of analyzing microscopic evidence in a private facility while the primary suspect remained completely unidentifiable. The local agency had gambled with the timeline, and the stakes could not have been higher. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. He was moving with deliberate and chilling purpose. He was casing the neighborhood. The true horror of this case was not just the slow response or the internal politics. The ultimate tragedy was rooted in a single conversation that happened long before the violence ever began. To truly understand the magnitude of the systemic failure, we must rewind the clock and examine the entire sequence of events with complete clarity. The ultimate betrayal in this narrative is not the delayed laboratory results or the political maneuvering. The most crushing twist lies in the realization that the entire tragedy was completely preventable. The network of protection failed not because it was overwhelmed by a mastermind criminal, but because it was deliberately switched off by the very people supposed to maintain it. When we assemble all the fractured pieces of this narrative, a deeply disturbing picture emerges. The unknown man did not just materialize out of thin air on that dark Sunday morning. He spent weeks meticulously planning his assault. He was visible. He was operating in broad daylight. Meister observed this unidentified man carefully scanning the houses and studying the daily routines of the residents. He was studying the architecture of the community and the habits of his intended mark. The neighbor recognized the severe threat and sounded the alarm. They provided law enforcement with the exact intelligence required to stop a predator in his tracks. They handed the authorities a live opportunity to disrupt the planning phase of a violent offense. If the responding officers had simply taken that initial warning seriously, the entire trajectory of this story would be completely different. A competent response would have involved immediate tactical adjustments. The patrol division would have flooded the zone with marked vehicles to deter any further reconnaissance. Detectives would have aggressively canvassed the area to identify the suspicious truck that had been spotted lingering near the properties. They would have established a specialized watch on the homes of the most vulnerable residents. If those basic foundational police tactics had been deployed, the attacker would have been confronted the very next time he stepped onto the street. This was a severe anomaly in an area where strangers are instantly noticed. He would have been identified and interrogated before he ever had the chance to put on a mask or pack his dark bag. The invisible shield of community security would have been activated. Instead, the warning was met with stunning indifference. The casual dismissal from the detective claiming they had already handled it was a death sentence disguised as an administrative update. The authorities essentially gave the predator a free pass to continue his surveillance without any fear of interruption. They validated his assumption that the neighborhood was a soft target. This is the precise moment where the system became an active participant in the tragedy. The profound arrogance of dismissing a credible eyewitness account created the exact operational vacuum the attacker needed to execute his plan. The most terrifying aspect of forensic analysis is not discovering that a suspect left no physical trace. The most terrifying reality is discovering that a living, breathing witness practically begged the authorities to intervene and was completely ignored. Meister felt a deep sense of dread and immediately contacted the local police to report the suspicious activity. This was not a failure of technology or a lack of resources. This was a catastrophic failure of human judgment. The officers allowed their own egos to override their fundamental duty to investigate. They assumed they knew better than the citizen who lived on that street and observed the anomaly firsthand. The consequences of that single dismissive conversation are permanently etched into the concrete of the front porch. The blood left behind is a direct result of the negligence that occurred 3 weeks earlier. The entire concept of proactive policing was abandoned in favor of lazy assumptions. The department chose to react to a nightmare rather than preventing it from becoming reality. We are witnessing a masterclass in how to dismantle public trust piece by piece. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that the victim did everything right. This was the golden opportunity to prevent a tragedy. She lived securely. She maintained her independence. Her neighbors were vigilant and proactive. The community functioned exactly as it was supposed to. The only component that completely failed was the institutional safeguard. This case exposes the lethal danger of administrative apathy. It demonstrates how a simple brush-off can trigger a devastating chain reaction. The true villain here is the person in the mask, but the enablers are the individuals wearing the badges who refused to listen. Our core mission here at the Ellis Evidence Room is to shine a relentless light on these exact types of institutional failures. We are not just here to figure out who pulled the trigger or broke down the door. We are here to relentlessly identify exactly who left the safety latch completely unhooked. We will continue to cross-examine every single official statement because the victims deserve a level of scrutiny that the system clearly refuses to provide itself. The authorities could have increased patrols or questioned the man. Instead, they did practically nothing. The realization that this entire ordeal could have been stopped with a single proactive patrol is a heavy burden for the community to carry. The frustration is immeasurable, but the reality of the present moment is even more bleak. The anger over past mistakes must eventually give way to the grim reality of the current situation. The system broke down, and now a family is left to navigate the excruciating aftermath entirely on their own. The current state of this investigation is a masterclass in agonizing stagnation. Despite the massive public outcry and the intense media scrutiny surrounding the leadership failures, the core objective remains unfulfilled. The elderly woman is still missing. The digital silence that began in the early hours of that Sunday morning continues to echo loudly. The application designed to monitor her heartbeat has not registered a single data point since the connection was violently severed. The servers are endlessly waiting for a signal that may never return. The technological tether that connected her to safety is permanently broken. The house in the affluent Catalina foothills of Tucson belongs to an 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie. This ignored warning becomes even more devastating when you understand who lived inside the targeted home. The physical search efforts have yielded absolutely nothing since the discovery of the contaminated clothing item. The desert landscape surrounding the community is vast and unforgiving, offering countless places to conceal evidence. The trail went cold, the exact moment the attacker slipped past the initial chaotic response. The focus remains entirely trapped inside the walls of the independent processing facility. The biological material extracted from the fabric is slowly moving through the complex machinery of private genetic analysis. The scientists are working to construct a sprawling family tree based on the microscopic cellular debris left behind by the masked intruder. They are searching for a distant cousin or a forgotten relative who might share a fraction of the genetic code. The process is incredibly precise, but it is excruciatingly slow. The family is trapped in an endless cycle of waiting for a phone call that could shatter their world or offer a desperate glimmer of hope. They are forced to live in a state of suspended animation while the bureaucratic gears grind at their own pace. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old and relied on a pacemaker and daily medication to survive. The painful reality is that even if the genetic profile eventually produces a verified name, the damage has already been done. A successful identification will finally allow the authorities to issue an arrest warrant and hunt down the individual responsible. It will bring the masked man into the light and subject him to the full weight of the judicial system. But a genetic match cannot reverse time. It cannot undo the terror of that night. Most importantly, it cannot fix the broken institutional culture that allowed the abduction to happen in the first place. The science will eventually name the attacker, but it will never name the specific arrogance that caused the initial warning to be discarded. The accountability for the systemic negligence will require a completely different type of investigation. The community is left grappling with a profound loss of security. The residents now understand that living in an affluent neighborhood does not guarantee protection from a determined predator or an incompetent police force. The agonizing weight is fundamentally changing the way the neighbors interact with their environment. However, she was not a helpless victim waiting to be taken. They no longer trust the deputies driving past their homes. They have started forming their own civilian watch groups, relying on their own communication networks to share information about suspicious vehicles. They have realized that outsourcing their personal safety to an unreliable agency is a fatal mistake. The burden of vigilance has shifted entirely onto the shoulders of the ordinary citizens. The family continues to issue desperate public pleas for information, holding press conferences that highlight their unimaginable pain. They stand before the cameras pleading for anyone with knowledge to step forward while simultaneously managing their profound anger toward the officials who let them down. The emotional toll is completely devastating and entirely unjustified given the early warnings provided to the authorities. The biological evidence is the only remaining lifeline. The entire narrative now hinges on a microscopic strand of data floating in a laboratory vial. We will inevitably learn the identity of the person who carried the dark bag and disabled the electronics. She was a fiercely independent woman who maintained her own schedule and managed her own life with impressive sharpness. The genealogy will eventually provide the final missing piece of the criminal puzzle. But the broader questions about accountability and public trust remain completely unanswered. The silence of the missing woman is a constant reminder of the massive failures that occurred. The resolution of this case will not bring closure. It will only bring a different kind of devastating clarity. There are two critical lessons embedded in the tragic timeline of this investigation. The first is a practical understanding of pre-crime indicators, specifically the behavior known as casing. Criminals do not strike randomly when targeting a secure residence. They observe, they park their vehicles without a clear purpose. They repeatedly evaluate the same sight lines and monitor the predictable routines of the occupants. She lived alone by choice. She attended church regularly and kept her home in immaculate condition. The eyewitness in this narrative recognized these exact red flags. The crucial takeaway for your own safety is to never implicitly trust that the authorities have the situation under control if your instincts are screaming that something is deeply wrong. If you observe someone casing your environment, you must become your own first line of defense. Document license plates independently. Take photographs from a secure location. Fortify your own perimeter, because the initial police response might simply be a dismissive wave. The second lesson requires an analytical shift. What this case teaches us about the lethal friction between local egos and federal resources is absolutely terrifying. This is a textbook example of a catastrophic system failure. When the desperate need to protect local jurisdiction overshadows the pursuit of rapid justice, the civilian population always pays the ultimate price. The agonizing delay in processing the genetic material was entirely manufactured by administrative arrogance. Her independence made her a specific calculated target rather than a random crime of opportunity. Bureaucracy and petty turf wars are the ultimate enemies of the golden hour in any major investigation. When local departments prioritize their own political optics over the immediate deployment of massive federal capabilities, the protective network collapses completely. The system is designed to share information rapidly, but when ego steps in, the machinery grinds to a halt. This narrative proves that the most dangerous element in a community might not just be the criminal lurking outside, but also the dysfunctional agency operating within. The physical reality of this case always leads back to the very beginning. An empty concrete porch sits quietly in the desert sun. The dark stains have dried, but they refuse to fade completely, serving as a permanent reminder of severe institutional neglect. A devastated family remains trapped in an endless nightmare, waiting for a critical phone call that relies entirely on a backlogged private laboratory. We at the Ellis Evidence Room will continue to relentlessly track the progress of the genetic genealogy analysis. We will be the first to break down the court documents the absolute second that the microscopic evidence finally produces a verified suspect. The person who was casing the street 3 weeks prior was not looking for an easy grab. But the true haunting question we must carry forward extends far beyond the identity of the masked intruder. How many more innocent lives must be violently shattered before a broken, bureaucratic law enforcement system finally recognizes that it needs to be completely dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up? Make sure you are subscribed and have those notification bells turned on so you do not miss our immediate follow-up the moment the federal authorities release the final laboratory results on this case. They were studying the environment to understand exactly how to breach a secure home without triggering an immediate alarm. They were watching the comings and goings to find the perfect window of absolute vulnerability. The days ticked by. After the initial report from Meister, the police presence remained stagnant. She is the mother of a prominent national television anchor. The neighborhood settled back into a false sense of security. The residents had no idea that a predator had already mapped their streets and selected a victim. He was not just walking by, he was lingering near property lines and examining the sight lines between the houses. Meister knew instinctively that this man did not belong there. He was evaluating camera angles and identifying blind spots. When Meister reached out to the authorities, he expected a swift and decisive response to secure the community. The lack of action sent a silent message to the predator that the street was completely unprotected. Nancy continued her daily routine of gardening and organizing her home entirely unaware that she was being studied. The meticulous nature of her life was being used against her. The predator noted when she was alone and when she had visitors. The preparation was cold and methodical. But on this specific morning, the wealth and quiet security of her neighborhood offer absolutely no protection. This brings us to the evening of January 31st, 2026. The winter air was crisp and quiet. Nancy had just finished having dinner with her family. Her son-in-law drove her back to her house and made sure she was safely inside. It was approximately 9:50 in the evening. The lights went out. The neighborhood was silent. The pacemaker application on her phone continued to register her steady heartbeat. Everything appeared perfectly normal and completely secure. Nancy went to sleep, believing she was safe in her own home. She had absolutely no idea that the protective shield of local law enforcement she relied upon was entirely hollow. The police had already dismissed the threat. The predator was now ready to execute the plan he had been perfecting for 3 weeks. The steady digital pulse of the pacemaker app was the only witness left in the dark. Someone has bypassed the physical locks. Someone has physically dismantled the security camera. The electronic timeline of what happened next is entirely cold and utterly devoid of human emotion. A physical timeline leaves room for interpretation, but digital footprints provide a rigid and terrifying sequence of events. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, the security perimeter of the Guthrie home was breached. The doorbell camera, which was designed to alert the homeowner and record any intruders, was physically disconnected. The feed went completely dark. This was not a random technological glitch or a power outage. The disconnection required physical manipulation. The intruder knew exactly where the camera was located and precisely how to disable it without triggering a secondary alert. This indicates a level of premeditation that aligns perfectly with the suspicious casing behavior reported weeks earlier. The attacker moved through the darkness With extreme confidence, they navigated the blind spots they had previously identified. Then came the most chilling digital timestamp of all. Someone has vanished with a vulnerable but fiercely independent elderly woman into the dead of night. Between the initial camera blackout and 2:28 in the morning, another vital connection was severed. Nancy relied on a specialized pacemaker that transmitted data directly to an application on her smartphone. This application sent regular updates to her medical providers to ensure her heart was functioning properly. A few minutes after the doorbell camera went blind, the pacemaker application completely lost its signal. The connection between the medical device inside her chest and the phone resting in her home was permanently broken. This could only mean one of two things. Either the phone was destroyed or Nancy was physically removed from the Bluetooth range of the device. The silence that followed was absolute. The digital heartbeat flatlined not because her heart stopped, but because she was violently taken away from her lifeline. The rest of the night passed without a single alarm sounding. The sun rose on Sunday, February 1st. The neighborhood woke up completely oblivious to the violence that had unfolded just hours before. Yet, the most chilling aspect of this entire crime scene is not the blood on the porch or the severed wires hanging from the wall. Nancy was a devout woman who never missed her Sunday morning church service. When she failed to arrive for the congregation, her family immediately knew something was terribly wrong. They rushed to her house in the Catalina foothills, expecting to find her perhaps recovering from a fall or dealing with a sudden medical emergency. Instead, they were greeted by a scene of quiet devastation. The front door area was deeply unsettling. Down on the concrete porch, they discovered the smeared trail of human blood. The family immediately contacted the authorities. The Pima County Sheriff Department dispatched deputies to the scene. The officers arrived to find the disabled camera and the blood-stained concrete. This was no longer a case of a confused elderly woman wandering away from home. The blood confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that a violent physical struggle had taken place right on the doorstep. The timeline was established. The attacker had a massive head start. The true nightmare lies in a warning that was delivered to local law enforcement 3 weeks before a single drop of blood was ever spilled. The digital silence of the pacemaker application confirmed that the victim was entirely cut off from the outside world. The attacker was highly organized and completely ruthless. The precision required to manually disable multiple electronic devices points to an offender who is dangerously comfortable operating in the dark. They managed to extract an 84-year-old woman from a secure neighborhood without waking a single neighbor. They left behind nothing but severed wires and a bloody porch. The questions immediately began to mount. How did the attacker know exactly where to find the camera? How did they know about the pacemaker application? The answer lies in the days leading up to the abduction. The attacker had done their homework while the police slept on the job. The horrifying reality was beginning to set in for the family.